The wind had been howling all afternoon, bending the tall wheat stalks like waves in a restless sea. Samuel Harper, a weathered farmer with silver streaks in his hair and calloused hands, trudged along the muddy path that led to his old wooden barn. He had lived alone on this small plot of land for nearly 2 decades, ever since his wife had passed and his children had grown and moved to cities far away. Most of the townsfolk thought him gruff, perhaps even unfriendly, but Samuel preferred it that way. The world, he believed, was too full of disappointment to invite anyone in. The barn was quiet, the house dim, and yet, in the silence, he had found a strange kind of peace, one that suited a man who had chosen solitude as his companion. That peace, however, was about to be disrupted. Clouds had gathered like an army on the horizon, and the sky darkened to an ominous gray. Samuel could sense the storm brewing, the kind that could rip apart weaker structures and wash away dreams along with mud. He tightened the straps on his boots and returned to the farmhouse, thinking about the sheep grazing in the distant fields, wondering if he should bring them closer. And then, as if summoned by the storm itself, a knock echoed on his door. At first, Samuel hesitated. Visitors were rare in these parts, and he had no appetite for interruptions. But another knock followed, this one firmer, more urgent. When he opened the door, 6 women stood there, drenched by the rain that had started to fall in sharp, stinging drops. Their faces were etched with fear and exhaustion, and in their eyes, Samuel saw a silent plea that stirred something long dormant within him. "Please, sir," the tallest of the women said, her voice quivering. "We need shelter. The storm, our homes won't hold." Samuel swallowed, his throat dry. He glanced at his small, modest farmhouse, and then at the women. They were strangers, from towns scattered across the valley, seeking protection from nature's wrath. It would have been easy to close the door, to send them to fend for themselves. It would have been easier to return to his life of quiet solitude. But something inside him, perhaps a memory of his late wife, perhaps a spark of empathy he had almost forgotten, nudged him forward. "Come in," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "You can stay until the storm passes." The women hesitated for a moment, exchanging surprised glances, and then stepped inside, shaking off the rain. Samuel led them into the barn, clearing space near the haylofts where they could sit and stay dry. He brought blankets, old lanterns, and even some canned food he had been saving. As the storm raged outside, the barn became a sanctuary, a small haven against the fury of wind and water. At first, conversation was tentative. The women spoke in hushed tones, their voices mixing with the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. Samuel listened, learning of their lives, of single mothers trying to hold their families together, of young women fleeing abusive situations, of widows who had nowhere else to turn. Each story was different, yet each one carried the same thread, a struggle for survival, a need for kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. As night fell, the storm reached its peak. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the barn in brief, white bursts. Thunder shook the walls, and Samuel felt the old fear creep into his chest, not for himself, but for these 6 women who had come to him in desperation. He made sure the doors were latched, the animals safe, and that the women had warmth and comfort. One of them, a young woman named Clara, clutched her shawl tightly, whispering, "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't let us in." Samuel didn't respond immediately. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, he sat quietly on a stool near the fire, watching the storm and the women huddled together. Something shifted inside him, an awareness that his life, once solitary, could still touch others, could still matter. And in that awareness, he felt a connection he had not realized he craved, a shared humanity, fragile yet enduring, resilient yet tender. Hours passed. Slowly, the storm began to ease, and the first light of dawn peeked through the clouds. The rain lessened to a gentle drizzle, and the women stirred, stretching tired limbs and exchanging smiles. There was a sense of gratitude in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the unexpected refuge Samuel had offered. Then came the moment that changed everything. The women, each carrying a small token of thanks, gathered around Samuel. They spoke in unison, their voices soft but resolute. "You saved us, but more than that, you reminded us that kindness exists, even in the loneliest places. Please, let us stay. Not just until the storm passes, but as long as we are welcome." Samuel blinked, caught off guard. He had lived alone for so long, telling himself that solitude was enough, that relationships brought only complications. And yet, here were 6 women, strangers at first, now offering him something he had almost forgotten: community, warmth, the laughter and chatter that filled the spaces his grief had hollowed out. For the first time in years, Samuel felt tears sting his eyes. He nodded slowly, a smile breaking through the weathered lines of his face. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "All of you, as long as you like." The days that followed were a revelation. Samuel found himself rising earlier, cooking meals, tending not just to his farm but to the lives that now intertwined with his own. The barn, once a place of solitude, became a lively gathering spot, filled with shared stories, music, and the simple joy of companionship. Samuel taught the women about farming, about planting and harvesting, about the patience that life sometimes demands. In turn, they taught him about courage, resilience, and the beauty of opening one's heart to the unexpected. It wasn't just the farm that transformed. Samuel himself changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The gruff, solitary man had become a mentor, a friend, a protector. He laughed more freely, worried less about minor inconveniences, and learned that love and kindness were not confined to family alone. They could extend to anyone brave enough to knock on your door in a storm. Months later, when the first snow of winter dusted the fields with sparkling white, Samuel looked out across his land, no longer empty but alive with life. The women, now friends, had settled in comfortably, and the farmhouse buzzed with warmth and laughter. Samuel realized that the storm, which had initially seemed a threat, had been a catalyst, a moment that brought people together, a chance for humanity to shine through fear and isolation. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, Samuel reflected on what had happened. He understood, finally, that life's true wealth was not measured in acres or possessions but in acts of generosity, in the courage to open one's heart to strangers, in the willingness to stand as a shelter in the storms of others' lives. And as he looked around at the women who had become his family, he knew that he would never, ever return to the solitude he had once thought so necessary. In that quiet, glowing moment, Samuel Harper understood something profound. Kindness begets connection, courage invites love, and even a lone farmer, living in the middle of nowhere, could create a haven, a home, for those who needed it most. And sometimes, it is in the tempest, when the wind and rain are fiercest, that the human heart discovers its most enduring strength. As the stars emerged in the winter sky, twinkling over fields once battered by storm, Samuel felt hope bloom inside him like a perennial flower. Life, he realized, is unpredictable, fragile, and fleeting, but it is also extraordinary. And sometimes, all it takes is a simple act of compassion to turn isolation into family, fear into trust, and a house into a home.